The town called him crazy long before the first snow fell, but when the temperature dropped to 40 below and every furnace in Pine Ridge went silent, Marcus Webb's underground shelter became the only place left where breath didn't freeze in your lungs. Before we dive into this story, make sure to smash that subscribe button because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will absolutely blow your mind. The mountain air in Pine Ridge, Colorado, carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke on a late August afternoon when Marcus Webb first broke ground on his property. He was 42 years old, lean and quiet, with hands that still remembered how to read blueprints even though he hadn't touched one professionally in 3 years. His plot of land sat 2 miles outside town, tucked against the foothills where the aspen trees turned gold every fall, and the wind spoke in whispers only the lonely could hear. Marcus had moved to Pine Ridge after the accident. That's what people called it when they thought he couldn't hear. The accident. Like it was something small, something forgettable. But losing your wife and 8-year-old daughter to a flash flood wasn't an accident. It was a shattering, a complete destruction of everything that made life worth living. He'd been a mechanical engineer in Denver back then, designing climate control systems for high-rises, making 6 figures, living the dream. Then one camping trip, one unseasonable storm, one swollen creek, and everything ended. He sold the Denver house, quit his job, and drove until he found a place that felt far enough away from the memories. Pine Ridge was a town of 1,100 souls, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the diner closed at 7 and the nearest Walmart was 45 minutes down the mountain. It suited him. He took odd jobs, fixed things, kept his head down, and tried to forget. But forgetting wasn't the same as healing, and healing wasn't the same as preparing. The excavator arrived on a Tuesday morning, rumbling up the dirt road that led to Marcus's property. Carl Henderson, who ran the only equipment rental company in 3 counties, hopped down from the cab with a clipboard and a confused expression. "You sure about this, Marcus?" Carl asked, squinting at the hand-drawn plans Marcus had given him the week before. "That's a hell of a hole you're wanting to dig." Marcus nodded, pulling on his work gloves. "I'm sure." "What are you building? Storm cellar?" "Something like that." Carl didn't press, and Marcus appreciated that. By noon, the excavator had carved a rectangular pit into the earth, 30 feet wide, 60 feet long, and 12 feet deep. The sound of diesel and scraping earth echoed off the surrounding pines, and within an hour, 3 pickup trucks had pulled over on the road to watch. Small towns ran on gossip like engines ran on gasoline, and Marcus Webb digging a massive hole in his backyard was premium fuel. By the time the sun started to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Marcus stood at the edge of the pit, staring down at the raw earth. He could already see it in his mind. Reinforced concrete walls, steel support beams, a ventilation system that could filter outside air, geothermal heating coils buried even deeper, water storage, food storage, medical supplies, sleeping quarters, everything needed to survive when the world above ground became unlivable. He didn't know when it would happen. He just knew it would. The next morning, Marcus was back at work before dawn. He'd ordered the concrete, hired a local contractor named Paulson to help with the heavy lifting, and started mapping out the electrical systems. The town's curiosity had shifted from passive to active. People didn't just drive by anymore. They stopped, got out, stood at the property line, and stared. "What's Webb building?" someone asked at the diner. "Some kind of bunker," another replied. "For what?" "Who knows? Guy's been weird since he moved here." The whispers grew louder as the weeks passed. Marcus worked from sunrise to sunset, sometimes later, floodlights illuminating the construction site like a stage. He poured the foundation himself, mixing concrete in a rented mixer, wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow, until his shoulders burned and his hands blistered. Paulson helped when he could, but even he seemed uneasy. "Marcus," Paulson said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his forehead. "People are talking." "Let them talk. They're saying you've lost it, that you're building some kind of doomsday thing." Marcus didn't look up from the rebar he was tying. "Maybe I have. By mid-September, the walls were up. Thick concrete, reinforced with steel, designed to withstand external pressure and temperature extremes. Marcus had calculated load-bearing capacity, thermal mass, insulation factors, all the engineering principles he'd once applied to skyscrapers now focused on a hole in the ground. He installed a ventilation system with HEPA filters, a geothermal heat pump that tapped into the Earth's constant temperature 50 feet down, and a rainwater collection system that fed into underground storage tanks. The town council got involved in late September. Mayor Donald Pritchard showed up with 2 council members, clipboards in hand, official expressions plastered on their faces. Pritchard was 63, with a gut that hung over his belt and a voice that carried the authority of someone who'd never been challenged in his life. "Marcus," Pritchard said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to talk about what you're doing here." Marcus climbed out of the pit, covered in dust and concrete residue. "What about it?" "Building codes, permits. You can't just dig a hole and build whatever you want without proper authorization." Marcus reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded stack of papers. "Already filed. Everything's in order." Pritchard took the papers, scanned them, frowned. "This says you're building a storm shelter." "I am. This is a hell of a lot more than a storm shelter." Marcus crossed his arms. "Is there a legal maximum size for storm shelters in Pine Ridge?" One of the council members, a woman named Patricia, stepped forward. "Marcus, people are concerned. This looks like you're preparing for the end of the world or something. It's making folks nervous." "Why would my preparations make anyone nervous?" "Because it's not normal," Pritchard said, his voice rising slightly. "Normal people don't spend their life savings digging holes in the ground." Marcus held the mayor's gaze. "Normal people also don't lose their families to floods that weather services said wouldn't happen. Normal people don't watch their little girl get swept away because they trusted the experts who said it was safe. So maybe I'm not normal anymore. But everything I'm doing is legal, it's on my property, and it's not hurting anyone." The silence that followed was heavy. Patricia looked away first. Pritchard shuffled the papers, cleared his throat. "Just make sure you follow the codes," Pritchard muttered, then turned and walked back to his truck. After they left, Marcus stood alone at the edge of his property, watching their taillights disappear down the road. His hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the memory. He could still see Emma's face, his daughter, her small hand slipping from his grip as the water pulled her under. He could still hear his wife Sarah screaming his name before the current took her too. He'd been the only one to make it out, dragged to shore by a stranger who happened to be hiking nearby. The engineers had said the campground was safe. The weather service had said the storm would pass to the north. Everyone had said it would be fine. Everyone had been wrong. Marcus went back to work. October arrived with the first hints of cold. The aspen leaves turned gold, then fell, carpeting the forest floor. Marcus installed the electrical system, running lines from a combination of grid power and a backup generator with enough fuel storage to run for months. He built bunk beds along one wall, installed a small kitchen area with a propane stove, and created a medical station stocked with first aid supplies, medications, and equipment he'd ordered from medical supply companies. The mockery intensified. At the hardware store, where Marcus bought most of his supplies, groups of men would go quiet when he walked in, then snicker after he passed. Someone spray-painted crazy on his mailbox. Kids rode their bikes past his property, pointing and laughing. The local newspaper ran a tongue-in-cheek article titled, "Local Man Prepares for Apocalypse. Should we be worried?" Only one person didn't mock him, Raymond Fuller, the owner of Fuller's Hardware and Supply. Raymond was 71, a Korean War veteran with a limp from shrapnel and a sharp mind that age hadn't dulled. He'd watched Marcus buy materials for months, never asking questions, always making sure Marcus got what he needed. One late afternoon in mid-October, as Marcus loaded bags of insulation into his truck, Raymond approached him. "You know what you're doing?" Raymond asked. Marcus looked at him, surprised by the genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "I hope so. I've seen men prepare for things before. Overseas, we used to dig in before the enemy arrived. Some guys, they'd dig foxholes just deep enough to hide. Others, the smart ones, they'd dig deep, reinforce, plan for the long haul. You remind me of the smart ones. Marcus didn't know what to say. Raymond continued. People here, they've had it easy their whole lives. No wars fought on this soil, no real disasters. Not in living memory anyway. They think because it hasn't happened, it won't happen. But you know different. I do. Whatever you're preparing for, I hope it doesn't come. But if it does, I hope you're right about what you're building. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to Marcus in months. By early November, the shelter was nearly complete. Marcus had installed a water filtration system that could purify and recycle grey water, built food storage shelves that he'd been steadily stocking with canned goods, dried foods, and freeze-dried meals, and created a small bathroom area with a composting toilet. The sleeping quarters could accommodate 30 people comfortably, maybe 50 in an emergency. He'd even thought about children, installing some smaller bunks, stocking toys and books, creating a space that wouldn't feel like a tomb. The entrance was designed with multiple layers, a reinforced steel door at ground level hidden behind what looked like an ordinary tool shed, then a staircase leading down to a second door, equally strong, with manual and electronic locks. The ventilation shafts were camouflaged, disguised as natural outcroppings and old drainage pipes. From the outside, unless you knew what to look for, the property looked like it just had an oversized shed and a lot of disturbed earth. The first snow came on November 15th. Just a dusting, enough to coat the pines and make the morning world look clean and new. Marcus stood outside his shelter's entrance, breath visible in the cold air, and watched the sun rise over the mountains. He'd spent nearly every penny he had on this project. His savings were gone, his credit cards maxed out, but it was done. Or nearly done. He still needed to run a few more tests, stock a bit more food, but the shelter was operational. He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, then went back inside to check the heating system. The town's mockery reached its peak in late November. Someone started a Facebook group called Marcus Webb's Doomsday Bunker Watch, where people posted photos of his property and made jokes about what he might be preparing for. Aliens, zombies, government takeover, the end times. The jokes were cruel but casual, the way small-town cruelty often is, wrapped in humor so no one had to acknowledge the meanness underneath. Marcus tried to ignore it, but ignoring something didn't make it hurt less. He'd see people in town, former neighbors, folks he'd helped fix things for, and they'd avoid eye contact or offer pitying smiles. The message was clear. He was broken, damaged, someone to be humored and avoided in equal measure. Only Raymond treated him normally. The old veteran would sometimes drive out to Marcus's property in the evenings, bringing coffee or sandwiches, sitting on the tailgate of his truck while Marcus worked. "My wife thinks I'm encouraging your insanity," Raymond said one evening, unwrapping a turkey sandwich. Marcus smiled slightly. "Are you?" "Nope. I'm just keeping company with a man who knows something the rest of us don't." "I don't know anything," Marcus said. "I'm just preparing. That's the difference. Knowing and preparing aren't the same thing. You don't have to know exactly what's coming to understand that something will come eventually." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains, the temperature already dropping into the 20s. December arrived cold. Colder than usual, the weathermen noted. Arctic air mass settling in early. But Pine Ridge was a mountain town. Cold was expected, manageable. People turned up their thermostats, stacked extra wood by their fireplaces, and went about their lives. Marcus continued stocking the shelter. He bought medical textbooks, how-to manuals, emergency reference guides. He installed a small library of books, both practical and recreational. He knew that in a real emergency, boredom and despair could be as dangerous as cold or hunger. He set up a small entertainment area with battery-powered devices, board games, decks of cards, anything to keep minds occupied. He also installed a radio system, both for receiving weather broadcasts and for emergency communications. He tested it regularly, scanning through frequencies, listening to the normal chatter of the world outside. On December 10th, he heard something that made him pause. A meteorologist on one of the NOAA weather stations sounded confused, concerned. An unusual polar vortex pattern was developing over northern Canada, massive, powerful, and moving in ways that didn't fit the models. The forecaster cautioned it was probably nothing, just an anomaly, but recommended people in northern states keep an eye on forecasts. Marcus turned up the volume and listened. Over the next week, the reports became more frequent, more urgent. The polar vortex was intensifying, growing larger, pushing south faster than anyone had predicted. Meteorologists from across the country were calling it unprecedented, a once-in-a-century event, maybe once in a millennium. Temperatures were dropping across Canada, hitting -50, -60 in some places. Power grids were struggling, and it was moving south. On December 17th, the first serious warnings were issued for Colorado. Extreme cold expected. Temperatures could drop to -30, possibly -40. Citizens advised to prepare, stock up on supplies, ensure heating systems were functional. Pine Ridge took it seriously, but not that seriously. This was Colorado. Cold happened. People bought extra groceries, checked their furnaces, made sure they had plenty of firewood. Life continued. Marcus worked around the clock. He did final systems checks, verified the geothermal heating was functioning perfectly, topped off his generator fuel, made sure every seal was tight, every door was secure. He moved his personal belongings into the shelter, the few things that mattered, photos of Sarah and Emma, his engineering notebooks, his father's old pocket watch. On December 20th, Raymond showed up at Marcus's property unannounced. He got out of his truck slowly, limping more than usual in the cold. "It's coming, isn't it?" Raymond asked. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, it's coming." "Bad?" "Worse than anything we've seen. The weather models are breaking down. The jet stream is collapsing. Temperatures are going to drop fast and stay down for days, maybe a week." Raymond looked at the shelter entrance, then back at Marcus. "This thing of yours, it'll hold?" "It'll hold." The old man nodded slowly. "Good, that's good." He started to leave, then turned back. "Marcus, when it happens, when people realize how bad it is, they're going to remember this place. They're going to remember you." "I know. You gonna help them? After how they treated you?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Yes." Raymond smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I figured you'd say that. You're a better man than most." He climbed back into his truck and drove away, tail lights disappearing into the early darkness. Marcus stood alone in the cold, watching the first heavy snowflakes begin to fall. The temperature was already dropping. He could feel it, that particular bite in the air that meant something bad was coming. He went inside the shelter, closed the first door, then the second. The sudden quiet was absolute. He checked the monitoring systems, the temperature gauges, the air quality sensors. Everything was green. Everything was ready. He sat down at the small desk he'd installed and opened his notebook. He'd been keeping a log of the construction, the decisions, the reasoning behind each choice. Now he wrote something different. December 20th. The storm is coming. I've done everything I can. If this fails, if I'm wrong, then I'll have wasted everything. But if I'm right, if it's as bad as I think it will be, then maybe this hole in the ground will save lives. Maybe I can keep someone else's daughter from being taken away. Maybe I can prevent other families from shattering like mine did. That has to be worth the mockery. That has to be worth being called crazy. Because being crazy and right is better than being sane and dead. He closed the notebook and walked to the wall where he'd hung a single photograph. Sarah and Emma, taken the summer before the flood. They were laughing at something, probably one of his bad jokes, the mountains stretching behind them. He touched the frame gently. "I miss you both every day," he whispered. "But maybe this is why I'm still here. Maybe this is what I'm supposed to do." The shelter hummed softly around him, warm and safe and ready. Outside, the temperature began to plummet. The morning of December 21st dawned grey and bitter. Marcus woke in his shelter at 5:30, the digital clock on the wall glowing softly in the darkness. He'd slept in one of the bunks, testing the systems, making sure everything functioned as designed. The geothermal heating kept the underground space at a steady 68 degrees, while outside, according to his weather monitor, the temperature had already dropped to 12 below zero. He climbed the stairs and opened the inner door, then the outer door. The cold hit him like a physical blow. His breath crystallized instantly. The world outside had transformed overnight. Snow covered everything in a thick blanket, and the wind howled through the pines with a sound like distant screaming. The sky was a uniform grey, heavy with the promise of more snow. Marcus checked his radio. The emergency broadcast system was issuing warnings now. The polar vortex had accelerated. Temperatures across Montana and Wyoming had hit -40 overnight. Frostbite could occur in minutes. Power grids were straining. The system was moving into Colorado faster than predicted. Pine Ridge still had power, but Marcus could hear the uncertainty creeping into the local radio announcer's voice. "Folks, this is serious. Make sure you've got plenty of heating fuel. Check on your neighbors, especially the elderly. The governor has declared a state of emergency. Stay indoors if at all possible." Marcus closed the shelter doors and drove into town. The streets were nearly empty. A few hardy souls moved between buildings, bundled in multiple layers. The hardware store was open, lights blazing in the grey morning. He found Raymond inside, stocking shelves with what looked like the last of his inventory of cold weather supplies. "Cleaned out yesterday," Raymond said without preamble. "People finally taking it seriously. Sold every space heater, every kerosene can, every thermal blanket I had." "It's going to get worse," Marcus said. Raymond nodded. "I know. I can feel it in my bones. This isn't normal cold. This is something else." Marcus bought the last few items he needed. Backup batteries, additional medical supplies, extra water purification tablets. As he paid, Raymond leaned across the counter. "Marcus, if things go sideways, really sideways, I'm telling people where you are. That okay?" Marcus met his eyes. "That's what it's for." By noon, the temperature had dropped to -18. The wind chill made it feel like -40. Marcus drove back to his property, noting how few cars were on the road. Smoke poured from every chimney in town. People were hunkering down. He spent the afternoon doing final preparations, bringing in extra firewood even though he didn't need it for the shelter, just in case. He filled every container he had with water from his well before it could freeze. He checked the generator one more time, the fuel lines, the electrical connections. At 4 o'clock, the sun began to set, though it had barely been visible all day. With the darkness came a new level of cold. Marcus's outdoor thermometer read -25. He'd never seen it that low, not in the 3 years he'd lived here. The radio crackled with increasing urgency. "All residents of Pine Ridge and surrounding areas, please shelter in place. Do not travel unless absolutely necessary. Temperatures are expected to reach -35 tonight, with wind chills of -50 or below. Frostbite can occur in less than 5 minutes. The town is opening the high school gymnasium as an emergency warming shelter for anyone without adequate heat." Marcus listened, his stomach tightening. The high school. With its old boiler system and drafty windows, it would help, but if the power failed, that building would become an icebox in hours. He tried to push the thought away. They'd be fine. Pine Ridge had weathered bad winters before. Except the radio kept getting worse. By 8 o'clock that evening, the temperature had hit -32, and then the first transformer blew. Marcus heard it from inside his shelter, a distant boom that echoed off the mountains. His lights flickered but stayed on, his system automatically switching to generator power. He turned up the emergency radio. "We've lost power in the north section of town," the announcer said, his voice tight. "Crews are working to restore it. In the meantime, those affected should proceed to the high school gymnasium. I repeat, if you've lost power, proceed to the warming shelter at the high school immediately." Marcus pulled on his heaviest coat, his insulated boots, 2 pairs of gloves. He grabbed a flashlight and headed out. He had to see for himself. The drive into town was treacherous. Ice coated the roads. The wind rocked his truck. His headlights cut through swirling snow that seemed to come from all directions at once. When he reached the edge of town, he could see the difference. Half of Pine Ridge was dark. Streetlights out, houses black, only the occasional flicker of candlelight or flashlight visible through windows. The high school, on the south side of town where power still flowed, blazed with light. Cars crowded the parking lot. People hurried from vehicles to the building, children bundled in their arms, elderly shuffled along with assistance. Marcus parked and went inside. The gymnasium had been converted into an emergency shelter. Blankets covered the floor, families huddled together. The town had set up space heaters around the perimeter, and the old boiler worked overtime to pump heat into the cavernous space. It was warm enough for now. He found Mayor Pritchard near the entrance, coordinating arrivals, his earlier authority now tempered with visible stress. "Marcus," Pritchard said, surprised, "you got power out at your place?" "I've got a generator. You're lucky." Pritchard looked back at the growing crowd. "We've got maybe 200 people here already, and more coming. The power company says it could be hours before they restore service to the north section." "What if they can't restore it?" Pritchard's face hardened. "They will. They have to." But even as he said it, the lights in the gymnasium flickered. Once, twice. Everyone looked up, conversations stopping mid-sentence. The lights steadied, and the collective exhale was audible. Marcus left the high school and drove through what remained of the lit sections of town. Everywhere he looked, people were struggling. Smoke poured from chimneys as fireplaces worked overtime. He saw a family trying to warm themselves around a barbecue grill they'd brought inside, a desperately dangerous move. Another house had every candle they owned lit, clustered together in the living room where the family huddled. This was just the first night. By midnight, the temperature hit -38. Marcus lay awake in his shelter, listening to the radio. 2 more transformers had blown. The power company was overwhelmed. Parts of the grid were failing faster than they could repair them. The cold was simply too extreme, too sustained, and it was only going to get colder. December 22nd arrived without a sunrise, just a gradual lightening of the grey darkness. Marcus emerged from his shelter to a world transformed into something hostile and alien. The wind had died during the night, leaving everything still and silent. His outdoor thermometer read -42 degrees. His breath didn't just fog, it crackled, ice crystals forming in the air around his face. He tried to start his truck. The engine turned over once, twice, then nothing. The cold had defeated it. He went back inside, suited up in every piece of cold weather gear he owned, and began the 2-mile walk into town. The journey took an hour. His face went numb despite the ski mask. His fingers tingled inside 2 pairs of gloves. Twice he had to stop and warm his hands inside his coat. This wasn't survivable. Not for long, not without serious protection. Pine Ridge looked like a ghost town. Nothing moved. No cars, no people, just smoke from chimneys and the occasional crack of a tree branch breaking under the weight of ice. The power was out in 3/4 of the town now. He could see which houses still had electricity by the glow of lights, but there were fewer than there had been the night before. The high school was chaos. The building had lost power at 3 in the morning. The boiler had died. The backup generator had run for 45 minutes before it too failed, frozen fuel lines. In those early morning hours, the temperature inside the gymnasium had begun to plummet. It was now hovering around 35 degrees inside and dropping steadily. Marcus found Pritchard in the hallway, surrounded by town council members and emergency personnel. The mayor's face was grey with exhaustion and fear. "We're trying to get buses to take people to Grand Junction," Pritchard said, "but the roads are impassable. 3 trucks have already slid off Route 27. We can't get anyone in or out." "What about the fire department?" someone asked. "They're trying to get portable heaters, but they only have 4 that work. 4 heaters for 200 people. We've got children here. We've got elderly. We've got people on oxygen." Marcus spoke up. "My shelter." Everyone turned to look at him. "Your what?" Pritchard asked. "My shelter. The thing you all thought was crazy. It's operational. It's warm. It can hold at least 150 people. Maybe more if we pack them in. The silence that followed was thick with shame and desperation, warring with pride. Patricia, the council member, spoke first. Marcus, after how this town treated you, after everything people said, you're offering to help. People are dying, Marcus said simply. Pride doesn't keep children warm. Pritchard's face worked through a series of emotions. Finally, he nodded. How do we get them there? Nothing's running. We're 2 miles from your property. We walk in groups. I'll lead them. We rotate, bring as many as we can, prioritize children and elderly first. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. By noon, the first group was ready. Marcus had organized them carefully. 20 people, 5 families with young children, 3 elderly residents, and several adults who could help carry supplies. They bundled in every piece of clothing they had. Marcus had them rope themselves together in a line so no one would get lost or left behind. Raymond was in the first group. I'm not letting you do this alone, the old veteran said. The journey was brutal. The wind had picked up again, driving snow into their faces like needles. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Marcus led them along the road, using landmarks he'd memorized. A bent pine tree, a distinctive boulder, the old fence line. People cried out in pain as the cold bit through their layers. Marcus called stops every 10 minutes, forcing everyone to check each other for frostbite, to warm hands and faces. One of the elderly men, Tom Garrison, collapsed halfway there. Marcus and Raymond lifted him between them, half carrying, half dragging him the rest of the way. By the time they reached Marcus's property, everyone was near the edge of hypothermia. Marcus got the shed door open and ushered them inside, down the stairs. When they reached the second door and he opened it, revealing the warm, well-lit space beyond, several people began to cry. The shelter's geothermal heating enveloped them like an embrace. Marcus got them inside, helped them remove wet outer layers, distributed warm blankets from his supply. The children were shaking so hard they couldn't speak. Marcus filled cups with hot water from his system, added instant cocoa powder, handed them out. My God, Patricia whispered, looking around at the bunks, the supplies, the sophisticated systems humming quietly. You built all this. You tried to tell us and we laughed. Doesn't matter now, Marcus said. What matters is getting everyone else here. He rested for 20 minutes, drinking water, eating a protein bar, warming his core. Then he and Raymond suited up again and made the journey back to town. It took them 90 minutes because the wind had gotten worse, the visibility nearly zero at times, but they made it. The second group was waiting. Marcus took 30 this time, now that he knew the shelter could handle it. More children, more elderly, more families. The trip was harder. The cold had deepened to -45. One woman's eyelashes froze together. A man's exposed cheek developed frostbite in the 5 minutes he'd forgotten to cover it. But Marcus pushed them forward, kept them moving, told them stories about Sarah and Emma, about why he'd built the shelter, about how every step was worth it. When they arrived at the shelter and descended into the warmth, the first group had hot food waiting. Someone had figured out how to use Marcus's kitchen. They'd made soup from his canned supplies. It was simple, just broth and vegetables, but to people who'd been freezing for hours, it was a feast. Marcus made 4 trips that first day. By the time darkness fell, he'd brought 70 people to safety. His body was beyond exhaustion. His face was raw from the cold. His fingers had gone numb so many times he'd lost count. But 70 people were alive and warm. Raymond sat beside him in the shelter, both of them too tired to move. There's more, Raymond said. At least 130 still at the school. I know, we'll get them tomorrow. Weather's supposed to get worse. I know that too. They sat in silence, listening to the sound of children playing in the sleeping area. Someone was reading a story. Someone else was singing quietly. Life continuing in spite of everything. December 23rd was the worst day yet. The temperature had bottomed out at -48 degrees. The radio reported that power was now out across the entire region. Pine Ridge was completely dark. The emergency frequency crackled with desperate calls. People trapped in their homes. Pipes frozen and burst. Carbon monoxide poisoning from people trying to heat their homes with cars running in closed garages. Marcus made 6 trips that day, each one harder than the last. The cold had become an enemy that wanted them dead, actively hostile, looking for any exposure, any weakness. He lost feeling in his toes after the 3rd trip and never got it back. His face was covered in broken blood vessels from the repeated freezing, but he kept going. Raymond organized the people in the shelter. He assigned tasks, rationed food, kept morale up with stories from his army days. The old veteran had found his purpose again. By the end of the day, 140 people crowded into Marcus's shelter. They filled every bunk, every floor space, but they were alive. They were warm. Not everyone made it. Tom Garrison, the elderly man Marcus had half carried in the first group, died of a heart attack on the 2nd day. The stress, the cold, his age, all had combined. Marcus and Raymond buried him in a corner of the shelter, wrapped in blankets, promising to give him a proper burial when the weather broke. 3 others died in town before Marcus could reach them. 2 elderly residents who'd refused to leave their homes. 1 middle-aged man who'd had a diabetic emergency with no way to get medical help. The town mourned, but Marcus didn't let them stop. There were still people who needed saving. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the temperature had been at -40 or below for 72 consecutive hours. Nothing in Pine Ridge functioned anymore. Natural gas lines had frozen. Backup generators across town had failed. The few people still in their homes were burning furniture to stay alive. Marcus made his final trips that day. He brought in the last holdouts, the proud ones who'd insisted they'd be fine, the stubborn ones who didn't want to admit they needed help. He found a family of 4 huddled in their bathroom, the smallest room in their house, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. The children's lips were blue. He got them to the shelter. He found Mayor Pritchard still at the high school, refusing to leave until everyone else was safe. The building's interior temperature was now 10 degrees above zero. Pritchard could barely walk, his feet frozen in his boots. Marcus had to carry him the last quarter mile. By nightfall on Christmas Eve, 183 people were packed into a shelter designed for 150. They were shoulder to shoulder, sharing bunks, sitting on floors, pressed together for warmth, even though the heating system kept the temperature comfortable. But no one complained. They were alive. Marcus stood at the entrance to his shelter, looking up the stairs at the closed doors above. Beyond those doors was a world of killing cold. Inside, behind him, was life. Crying babies, laughing children, adults talking quietly, the smell of cooking food, the sound of someone playing a harmonica. Raymond limped up beside him. "You did it. You saved them all." Marcus shook his head. "Not all. We lost 4. You saved 183. Without you, without this place, we'd have lost 200. Marcus leaned against the wall, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of exhaustion. His body ached in ways he'd never experienced. His hands shook with fatigue, but something else stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. He'd spent 3 years drowning in guilt, convinced he should have died with Sarah and Emma, convinced he'd failed as a husband and father. The shelter had been built from that guilt, a monument to his failure to protect the people he loved. But now he understood it differently. He hadn't built a tomb. He'd built a lifeboat, and it had saved people. Sarah would have been proud. Emma would have thought it was the coolest fort ever. The thought made him smile for the first time in days. That night, someone found a small Christmas tree in Marcus's supply closet. He'd bought it months ago before the cold came, thinking he might put it up for himself. Now it stood in the corner of the shelter, decorated with whatever people could find. Strips of aluminum foil as tinsel, drawings by children as ornaments, a few candles at the base, electric ones from Marcus's emergency supplies. Patricia organized a Christmas Eve service. She wasn't a preacher, but she read from a Bible someone had brought. She talked about shelter and salvation, about unexpected angels, about how grace sometimes came from the places we least expected. She looked directly at Marcus when she said it. The children sang carols, their voices high and pure in the underground space. Silent night, away in a manger. Joy to the world. Adults joined in, some crying, some smiling, all grateful to be alive to sing at all. Marcus sat in the back, watching. Families held each other. Strangers who'd spent their lives in the same small town but barely knew each other now shared blankets and stories. Raymond sat with a group of men, telling them about winters in Korea, how cold had been the real enemy, how survival had been about helping each other. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, broke away from her mother and walked over to Marcus. She had dark curls and serious eyes. She climbed onto his lap without asking permission. "Are you Santa?" she asked. Marcus blinked, surprised. "No, sweetie, I'm just Marcus." "My mommy says you saved us. She says you're a hero." Marcus's throat tightened. "I'm not a hero. I just prepared." "What's the difference?" He didn't have an answer for that. The girl leaned against his chest, her small warmth settling against him. Without thinking, Marcus wrapped his arms around her. She smelled like the shelter, like the soap he'd provided, like safety. And suddenly he was holding Emma again, feeling her weight, her trust, her absolute faith that her daddy would keep her safe. Except this time, he had. The tears came quietly, rolling down his weathered cheeks. He held the little girl and cried for the daughter he'd lost, for the wife who'd been taken, for the 3 years of guilt and isolation. But also for the 183 lives pressed into this underground space, for the children still laughing despite everything, for the chance to be someone's hero, even if he didn't feel like one. The girl fell asleep in his arms. Her mother came to collect her, whispering thank you through her own tears. Marcus watched them settle into a bunk across the room, the mother holding her daughter close. Raymond appeared with 2 cups of instant coffee, handing one to Marcus. "Merry Christmas," the old veteran said. Marcus raised his cup. "Merry Christmas." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the shelter full of life. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -50 degrees. The wind howled like something alive and angry. The entire town of Pine Ridge sat dark and frozen. Every pipe burst, every road impassable, every home an icebox. But here, 50 feet underground, warmth endured. Life endured. Marcus Webb, the man they'd called crazy, the man they'd mocked and pitied and dismissed, had been right all along. And in being right, he'd saved almost everyone in Pine Ridge who'd needed saving. The radio crackled with an update. The storm was expected to continue for at least 3 more days. National Guard couldn't get through. Emergency services were grounded. Pine Ridge was completely isolated. But Marcus had prepared for that too. He had food for a month if they rationed carefully, water for longer, heat indefinitely, medical supplies, everything they needed. He'd spent 3 years preparing for disaster, haunted by the one he couldn't prevent. Now, finally, his preparation had meaning. His suffering had purpose. His loss had been transformed into salvation for others. He looked around at the faces in the shelter. Not everyone was there. Some people had chosen to ride out the storm in their own homes, too proud or too stubborn to accept help from the man they'd mocked. Marcus hoped they'd survived, but he knew in his heart that some hadn't. You couldn't save everyone. He'd learned that 3 years ago in the worst way possible, but you could save who you could reach. And that had to be enough. As the makeshift Christmas Eve service ended and families settled in for the night, Marcus walked the length of the shelter one more time. He checked the heating system, the air filtration, the water supply. Everything was green. Everything was holding. He stopped at the small memorial they'd created for Tom Garrison and the others who'd died. 4 names written on a piece of paper, taped to the wall. Tom, Helen, Marcus, James. People who'd been his neighbors, even if they'd never been his friends. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," Marcus whispered. But I saved who I could. He returned to his small corner of the shelter, the single bunk he'd claimed for himself. He lay down, still fully dressed, and closed his eyes. Around him, the shelter breathed with life, soft snoring, whispered conversations, a baby fussing, then quieting, the hum of systems keeping them all alive. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Webb fell asleep without nightmares. He dreamed of Sarah and Emma, but they weren't drowning. They were smiling. They were proud. And in the morning when he woke, he'd face whatever came next. Because that's what survivors did. They endured, they adapted, they saved who they could save, and sometimes, if they were very lucky, they found redemption in the process. Christmas morning arrived without fanfare in the shelter. There was no sunrise to mark it, just the steady artificial light from Marcus's LED fixtures and the awareness that another day had come. The temperature outside had stabilized at -46 degrees, still deadly, still unrelenting, but no longer dropping. That small mercy felt like a gift. Marcus woke at 5:30, his internal clock refusing to adjust despite the exhaustion that had soaked into his bones. He lay still for a moment, listening to the shelter breathe around him. Snoring from multiple directions, the soft whir of air circulation, a child coughing somewhere in the darkness, the steady drip of condensation from the ceiling where warm air met cold concrete, a design flaw he'd tried to minimize but couldn't eliminate entirely. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb Raymond, who'd claimed the bunk next to his. The old veteran slept on his side, one arm tucked under his head, looking more peaceful than Marcus had ever seen him. They'd been strangers 6 months ago. Now Raymond felt like family, the kind forged in crisis rather than blood. Marcus made his way through the sleeping shelter, stepping over people, around makeshift beds made of blankets on the floor. 183 souls packed into a space that should have held 150. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cooking food, and the particular mustiness that came from too many people in too small a space for too long. But it was warm. It was safe. That's what mattered. In the kitchen area, he found Patricia already awake, boiling water on the propane stove. She looked up when he approached, offered a tired smile. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Old habit. You?" "Too many thoughts." She poured hot water into 2 cups, added instant coffee, handed him one. "Marcus, I need to apologize." "You already did. Not properly. Not for all of it." She wrapped her hands around her cup, seeking warmth even though the shelter was comfortable. "When you first started building this place, I was one of the loudest voices against you. At council meetings, at the diner, everywhere. I told people you were dangerous, that you were mentally unstable, that we should find a way to stop you." Marcus sipped his coffee, waiting. "I was wrong. About everything. You weren't crazy. You were smart. You were prepared. You were right." Her voice cracked slightly. "And you saved my grandchildren. Both of them. They're alive because you refused to listen to people like me." Marcus met her eyes. "I didn't build this to prove anyone wrong. I built it because I knew what happens when you're not ready, when you trust that everything will be fine and it isn't. Your family. The flood." He nodded. "I couldn't save them. But maybe I could save someone else's family. That had to mean something." Patricia wiped at her eyes. "It means everything. You gave us all a second chance." More people began to wake as the morning progressed. Children first, their resilience remarkable, already treating the shelter like an adventure rather than a crisis. They played in the sleeping area, building forts from blankets, trading stories about the cold outside like it was a monster they'd defeated together. The adults moved more slowly, groggy, still processing the reality of their situation. Marcus gathered the able-bodied adults in the main area around 7 o'clock. 30 people crowded around, some sitting on bunks, others standing, all watching him with an attention he'd never experienced before. These were people who'd ignored him, mocked him, avoided eye contact in the grocery store. Now, they hung on his every word. "We need to organize," Marcus began. "We've got enough food for about a month if we're careful, but only if we ration properly. We need cooking teams, cleaning teams, someone managing waste disposal, someone watching the children. This only works if everyone contributes. Raymond stepped forward. I'll handle work assignments. Did it in the army for years. Know how to keep people busy and useful. Good. Marcus pointed to a woman named Jennifer, a nurse from the local clinic. Medical needs? I've been doing rounds, Jennifer said. Mostly frostbite, minor stuff. A few people with chronic conditions who need their medications managed. Tom's not the only one with a heart condition, and we've got 3 diabetics. I'll need help monitoring everyone. Done. Who's good with kids? Several hands went up. Marcus assigned them to create a schedule, keeping children occupied, educated if possible, giving parents breaks to rest or help with other tasks. He organized the cooking rotation, the cleaning duties, the inventory management. Within an hour, the shelter had transformed from a chaotic crowd into something resembling a functional community. But organization only solved part of the problem. The psychological weight was something else entirely. By mid-morning on Christmas Day, the reality was setting in. People weren't just refugees from the cold anymore. They were prisoners of it, trapped underground with no idea when they'd be able to return to their lives. Tempers began to flare. A man named Dale complained loudly that his bunk was too close to the bathroom. 2 women argued about whose turn it was to watch the children. A teenager had a breakdown, crying that she was missing Christmas with her boyfriend who'd been visiting relatives in Denver. Marcus found himself playing mediator, counselor, and authority figure all at once. It wasn't a role he'd ever wanted, but it was the one he had. He listened to complaints, resolved disputes, and reminded people gently but firmly that they were alive, and that trumped every inconvenience. The radio brought news throughout the day, and none of it was good. The storm had intensified across the entire Rocky Mountain region. Denver was paralyzed. Colorado Springs had lost power completely. Small towns throughout the mountains had gone silent, communication cut off. The death toll was rising, though exact numbers were impossible to confirm. The governor made a statement, broadcast on emergency frequencies. To all Coloradans, we are in an unprecedented crisis. The National Guard is mobilizing but cannot reach many areas due to impassable roads. If you have heat and shelter, stay where you are. If you don't, seek help from neighbors. This is a time for communities to come together. We will get through this, but we must help each other. Marcus thought about the people in Pine Ridge who hadn't made it to the shelter. The stubborn ones, the proud ones, the ones who'd been too far away or too isolated. He'd tried to reach everyone, but physics and biology had limits. You could only walk so far in negative 40-degree weather. You could only carry so many people. He found himself standing at the memorial wall again, staring at the 4 names. Raymond appeared beside him, silent presence that needed no explanation. You're doing it again, Raymond said finally. Doing what? Carrying guilt that isn't yours. Those 4, they made choices. Tom's heart gave out because he was 87 and had 3 prior heart attacks. Helen refused to leave her house, even when you knocked on her door. The others, they were too far out, too isolated. You couldn't have saved them without killing yourself, and probably a dozen others trying. I should have tried harder. No, Raymond's voice was firm. You did exactly enough. You saved 183 people. That's 183 families who still have their loved ones. 183 futures that still exist. Stop focusing on the 4 you lost and start seeing the 183 you saved. Marcus wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. Because Raymond was right, and Marcus knew it, even if accepting it felt like betrayal. That afternoon, people began to open up about what they'd been through. Small groups formed, sharing stories. A man talked about watching his pipes burst, water flooding his basement, then freezing solid within minutes. A woman described the moment her furnace died, the temperature in her house dropping so fast she could see her breath within an hour. Parents spoke in hushed tones about their children's lips turning blue, about the terror of not knowing if they'd survive the night. And they talked about Marcus, about seeing him appear in the storm like a ghost, face wrapped in layers, only his eyes visible. About the rope he'd used to tie them together so no one would be lost. About his calm voice telling them to keep moving, one foot in front of the other. You can do this. We're almost there. About the moment the shelter door opened and warmth poured out like salvation. He carried my mother, one woman said, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't walk anymore. Her legs just gave out, and he picked her up and carried her the last half mile. She weighs 160 pounds, and he just carried her like she was nothing. Marcus, listening from across the shelter while pretending to check equipment, felt his face burn. He wasn't used to being seen, certainly wasn't used to being praised. For 3 years he'd been invisible, the weird guy on the edge of town. Now he was being called a hero, and it made him deeply uncomfortable. Jennifer, the nurse, found him in the equipment room where he'd retreated.
"You can't hide in here forever,"
she said. "I'm not hiding. I'm checking the water filtration system." "The water filtration system you checked 2 hours ago?" Marcus set down his wrench. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Be what they need me to be. I'm not a leader. I'm just a guy who dug a hole and bought supplies." Jennifer sat on an overturned bucket. "My father was a pastor. He used to say that leadership isn't about wanting power. It's about accepting responsibility when it's needed. You didn't ask to be a leader, but that's what these people need right now. Someone to look to. Someone who has answers. Someone who represents the possibility that we'll make it through this." "What if I don't have answers?" "Then you figure them out. That's what leaders do." She left him alone with his thoughts. Marcus stood in the small equipment room, surrounded by the machinery keeping them all alive, and felt the weight of 183 lives pressing down on him. It was heavier than any physical burden he'd ever carried. But maybe Jennifer was right. Maybe leadership wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was just about being willing to try. By evening, someone had organized a proper Christmas dinner. It was humble, canned ham heated on the propane stove, instant mashed potatoes, green beans from Marcus's supplies, but people treated it like a feast. They gathered in the main area, sitting wherever they could find space, plates balanced on laps, children sitting on parents' shoulders. Mayor Pritchard stood up, his frost-bitten feet wrapped in bandages, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch. The shelter fell silent. "I need to say something," Pritchard began, his voice rough. "For months I watched Marcus Webb prepare for disaster. I thought he was paranoid. I thought he was broken. I even tried to stop him, used building codes and regulations to make his life harder." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. Marcus tried to warn us. He tried to tell us that being prepared wasn't crazy, it was smart, and we laughed at him." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. This man, who had every reason to turn his back on us, who had every justification to say we deserved what we got, instead risked his life over and over to save us. He made more than a dozen trips through weather that should have killed him. He carried people who couldn't walk. He gave up his supplies, his space, his peace, everything to keep us alive. Pritchard's voice broke. "Marcus, I'm sorry. We're all sorry. And we're grateful. More grateful than words can express." The shelter erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, some crying, children cheering. Marcus sat frozen, overwhelmed, wanting to disappear into the floor. Raymond elbowed him gently. "Stand up," the old veteran whispered. "Let them thank you." Marcus stood awkwardly, face burning, not knowing where to look. The applause continued for a full minute before people finally settled back down. He sat quickly, relieved when attention shifted elsewhere. But something had changed. People looked at him differently now. Not with pity or mockery or even curiosity. With respect. With trust. With the kind of regard reserved for people who'd proven themselves when it mattered most. After dinner, the children performed a makeshift Christmas pageant they'd rehearsed in whispers throughout the day. It was chaotic and adorable, with blankets as costumes and flashlights as stage lighting. They told the story of the Nativity, then added their own ending about a man who built a shelter to save people from the cold. The parallels weren't subtle, and more than a few adults cried openly. Marcus watched from the back, chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. These children, who should have been home opening presents and eating cookies, were instead underground performing a play about survival. Yet they smiled, they laughed, they found joy in the smallest things. Resilience, Marcus realized, wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about emotional elasticity, the ability to bend without breaking, to find light in darkness, to keep living even when everything had gone wrong. That night, after the children had been put to bed and the adults had settled into quiet conversations, Marcus did his rounds. He checked every system, every gauge, every seal. The shelter was holding perfectly. Temperature steady at 68 degrees, air quality excellent, water supply at 80% capacity. They could survive here for weeks if necessary. But survival wasn't living, and these people couldn't stay underground forever. He climbed the stairs to the first door, then the second, and stepped outside into the airlock space between them. The cold seeped through immediately, even through the insulated walls. He cracked the outer door just enough to look out. The world was black and white and grey. Snow covered everything in massive drifts. The pines were bent under the weight of ice. The sky was clear for the first time in days, stars blazing with impossible brightness in the clean, frozen air. And the cold was like nothing Marcus had ever experienced. It hurt to breathe. Frost formed on his eyelashes in seconds. The exposed skin on his face felt like it was being cut with tiny knives. He closed the door and went back inside, sealing it carefully. The warmth of the shelter wrapped around him like a blanket. He descended the stairs slowly, thinking, they couldn't stay here forever. Eventually the food would run out. Eventually people would need medical care he couldn't provide. Eventually the psychological toll of being underground would become too much. This shelter was a lifeboat, but it wasn't a life. The storm had to break eventually. Weather always changed. And when it did, they'd need a plan. He found Raymond in the equipment area, inventorying medical supplies with Jennifer. "We need to start thinking about after," Marcus said. "After what?" "After the storm breaks. After we can get people out of here. The town is destroyed, every pipe is burst, every building is damaged. People's homes are going to be ice-damaged wrecks. We need a recovery plan." Raymond nodded slowly. "You're right. We can't just send people back to frozen houses." "The high school," Jennifer suggested. "If we can get heat restored there, it could be a staging area. We organize work crews, repair houses in order of priority, get people re-established." Marcus pulled out a notebook and started writing. For the next 2 hours, the three of them planned. They identified people with relevant skills, construction workers, plumbers, electricians. They prioritized which houses to repair first, based on family size and vulnerability. They discussed how to coordinate with outside help once roads were passable. It felt good to plan, to think beyond immediate survival toward actual recovery. It gave purpose to the waiting. Over the next 3 days, the shelter settled into a routine. Wake at 6, breakfast at 7, work assignments from 8 to noon, lunch, afternoon activities for children, maintenance and planning for adults, dinner at 6, evening social time, lights out at 10. People adapted in remarkable ways. A man who'd been an accountant organized a lending library with the books Marcus had stocked. A woman who'd taught piano lessons started teaching children songs, their voices echoing through the shelter in impromptu concerts. Teenagers formed a cleaning crew, taking pride in keeping the space orderly. Elderly residents became storytellers, entertaining children with tales from their youth. The shelter became more than a refuge. It became a community. But tensions remained. Close quarters and stress had a way of amplifying every personality flaw. Dale, the complainer, got into a shouting match with another man over blanket distribution. 2 families nearly came to blows over whose child had started a fight. A woman accused someone of stealing her food, only to find it later in her own bag. Marcus mediated each conflict, sometimes firmly, sometimes gently, always trying to remind people that they were on the same team. Raymond helped, his military experience giving him authority that people respected. Together they kept the peace, but it was exhausting. On the fourth day underground, December 28th, Jennifer came to Marcus with concern etched on her face. "We've got a problem. Sarah Hendricks, she's pregnant, 32 weeks. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Is she okay? For now. But if she goes into early labor, we don't have the equipment or expertise to handle complications. I'm a clinic nurse, not an obstetrician. If something goes wrong..." "How's she doing, stress-wise?" "Surprisingly well, actually, but we need to keep close watch. And we need to hope the storm breaks before she goes into labor." Marcus added it to his growing list of worries. A pregnant woman, limited medical supplies, no way to evacuate if things went wrong. He went to check on Sarah personally, found her sitting with her husband, Tom, both of them trying to stay calm. "Mr. Webb," Sarah said when she saw him. She was 26, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. "Jennifer said she talked to you." "She did. How are you feeling?" "Scared, but okay. The baby's moving normally. No contractions. I'm just trying to stay calm. If you need anything at all, you let me know immediately. You're priority one." She nodded, tears welling up. "Thank you for all of this. When Tom and I found out I was pregnant, we were so happy. Then the cold came and I thought, this is it. We're going to lose our baby. But you saved us. You saved our family." Marcus squeezed her shoulder gently. "You just focus on staying healthy. We'll handle the rest." As he walked away, the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. It wasn't just 183 lives anymore. It was 184. A baby not yet born, depending on him to keep its mother alive long enough to enter the world. That evening, the radio brought the first good news they'd had in days. The storm was weakening. The polar vortex was finally breaking apart. Temperatures across the region would begin to rise slowly over the next 48 hours. It wouldn't be warm, but it would be survivable. Help was coming. The shelter erupted in cheers and tears. People hugged each other, cried with relief, laughed with the kind of joy that only came from surviving something that should have killed you. Children danced. Adults smiled genuine smiles for the first time in days. Marcus felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. They'd made it. Against all odds, through the worst weather in recorded history, they'd survived. But the celebration was tempered by reality. The radio also reported that the death toll across Colorado had reached 217 confirmed, with hundreds more missing. Entire towns had gone silent. Emergency services were overwhelmed. It would be days, maybe weeks, before things returned to normal. Pine Ridge had lost 4. Compared to other communities, they'd been extraordinarily lucky. And that luck had a name. That night, people talked about the future, about rebuilding, about what they'd do when they got home, about lessons learned and promises to be better prepared next time. The conversations were animated, hopeful, touched with the particular energy that came from having faced death and won. Marcus sat with Raymond, both of them too tired to join the celebrations fully. "You know what happens next, right?" Raymond asked. "What?" "You become a legend, the man who saved Pine Ridge. They'll write articles, maybe books, definitely put up a plaque or name a street after you." Marcus grimaced. "I don't want any of that. Doesn't matter what you want. You did something remarkable. People don't forget that. I just prepared, that's all." "You did more than prepare. You had faith. Faith that what you were building mattered, even when everyone said you were crazy. That's not just preparation, that's vision." Marcus thought about that. Vision. He'd never considered himself visionary. He was just a broken man trying to make sense of tragedy. But maybe Raymond was right. Maybe there was something bigger at work. "What do I do with it?" Marcus asked. "The attention, the gratitude, all of it." Raymond smiled. "You do what you've been doing. You help people. You teach them. You share what you know, so maybe next time more people survive. That's how you honor what happened here." On December 29th, the temperature outside rose to -10 degrees. Still cold, still dangerous, but no longer instantly lethal. Marcus and a group of volunteers suited up and made the trek into town to assess the damage. What they found was devastating. Pine Ridge looked like it had been hit by a bomb. Every window in every building had shattered from the extreme cold. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of ice. Water from burst pipes had flooded buildings, then frozen solid, creating ice sculptures of former homes. Cars were encased in ice. Power lines hung broken and useless. The high school, their former shelter, was a disaster. The roof had partially collapsed. Everything inside was frozen solid. If people had stayed there, they would have died. Marcus stood in the middle of Main Street, surveying the destruction, and felt the full weight of what would have happened without his shelter. These weren't hypothetical deaths. These were specific people, children and families he knew, who would have frozen in their sleep if not for the underground refuge. Patricia stood beside him, tears freezing on her cheeks. "It's all gone. Everything." "Not everything," Marcus said quietly. "The people survived. That's what matters." "But how do we rebuild? Where do we even start?" "We start with heat. We start with shelter. We get the power back on. We repair one house at a time. We do what humans have always done. We survive, we adapt, we rebuild." By December 30th, help finally arrived. National Guard trucks rolled into Pine Ridge, bringing generators, heaters, food, medical supplies. FEMA set up a command center. Engineers assessed the damage. The cavalry had arrived, late but welcome. The shelter dwellers began to emerge, blinking in the weak winter sunlight, breathing fresh air for the first time in over a week. They were greeted by guardsmen who stared in disbelief that so many had survived in such a small space. A FEMA coordinator, a woman named Andrea, interviewed Marcus extensively. She wanted to know everything: how he'd designed the shelter, what systems he'd used, how he'd organized so many people, how he'd kept them alive. "Mr. Webb," she said finally, "what you did here is extraordinary. Most communities this size would have lost 50% of their population in conditions like this. You lost 2%. That's unprecedented. 4 people is still 4 too many. 4 people is a miracle compared to what could have been. We need to study what you did, make it a model for other communities, share your design, your planning, everything." Marcus nodded slowly. If sharing his knowledge could prevent other tragedies, other families from experiencing what he'd lost, then maybe it had all been worth it. Over the next week, Pine Ridge began the long process of recovery. The National Guard helped restore power to sections of town. Repair crews worked around the clock to make houses habitable. People moved out of the shelter gradually, returning to homes that would need months of work but were at least warm enough to survive in. Marcus kept the shelter open for anyone who needed it. Some elderly residents stayed longer, not wanting to return to damaged homes. A few families remained while their houses were being repaired. Sarah, the pregnant woman, stayed under Jennifer's careful watch. On January 5th, with the temperature finally above 0 for the first time in 2 weeks, Sarah went into labor. Jennifer and Marcus converted a section of the shelter into a makeshift delivery room. It was terrifying and beautiful and chaotic. Marcus, who knew nothing about childbirth, found himself boiling water and tearing sheets like characters in old movies, feeling utterly useless. But Jennifer, despite her fears about not being an obstetrician, guided Sarah through labor with calm expertise. And at 11:23 that night, a healthy baby girl entered the world. She came out screaming, pink and perfect and alive. Tom held his daughter with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. Sarah, exhausted but glowing, looked at Marcus. "We're naming her Hope," she said. "Hope Marcus Hendricks, because you gave us hope when we had none." Marcus couldn't speak. He just nodded, overwhelmed, and quietly left the room before anyone could see him cry. That night, he stood at the entrance to his shelter one last time. Most people had gone. The space felt empty, echoing, already becoming a relic of crisis past. He'd lived here for 2 weeks with 183 other people. Now it was just him and the handful who remained. Raymond found him there, limping over on his recovering feet. "Thinking deep thoughts?" the old veteran asked. "Thinking about what comes next. Everyone's leaving, going back to their lives, and I'll go back to being the weird guy on the edge of town." "You really think that? After all this?" "I don't know what to think." Raymond clapped him on the shoulder. You're not going back to being invisible. You can't. These people won't let you. You're part of this community now, whether you want to be or not. You saved them. They won't forget. More importantly, they won't let you be alone anymore. Over the following weeks, Raymond's words proved prophetic. People didn't leave Marcus alone. They showed up at his property offering help, bringing food, inviting him to dinner. Kids came by asking to see the shelter, treating him like a celebrity. The town council formally thanked him in a public ceremony he tried desperately to avoid but was forced to attend. They gave him a plaque that read, "To Marcus Webb, whose preparation, courage and compassion saved 183 lives during the Great Freeze of 2025. A true hero." Marcus accepted it with grace he didn't feel, gave a short speech about community and preparation, and went home feeling more uncomfortable than ever with the attention. But something had changed in him too. The isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor had cracked. He'd let people in, helped them, connected with them. And it hadn't destroyed him. It had rebuilt him. 3 months after the storm, Marcus stood in Raymond's hardware store, helping organize a community preparedness workshop. 50 people had shown up, wanting to learn how to prepare for disasters, how to design emergency systems, how to keep your family safe when the world went wrong. Marcus taught them everything he knew. He showed them his shelter design. He explained the systems. He walked them through decision trees for different scenarios. He answered every question with patience and detail, and when a young man, maybe 25, asked why he'd spent so much time and money preparing for something that might never happen, Marcus's answer was simple. "I lost my wife and daughter because I wasn't prepared, because I trusted that someone else would keep us safe. I can't bring them back, but I can make sure other families don't have to lose what I lost. That's worth every penny, every hour, every moment of mockery, because being called crazy is nothing compared to the sound of your child calling for you while she drowns." The room went silent. Then the young man nodded slowly. "Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for saving us." Marcus looked around the room at faces that had once ignored him, mocked him, dismissed him. Now they listened, they learned, they understood, not all of them, but enough. And maybe that would make the difference next time disaster came calling, because there would be a next time. There always was. Nature didn't care about human comfort or convenience. Disasters struck without warning or mercy. The only question was whether you'd be ready when they did. Marcus Webb had been ready. And now he was teaching others to be ready too. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It wasn't the life he'd wanted. But it was the life he had, forged from tragedy and tempered in service, and for the first time in 3 years that felt like enough. Spring arrived in Pine Ridge with the hesitant warmth of something that had been frozen too long. The snow began to melt in early March, revealing a town transformed by trauma. Buildings still bore scars from the Great Freeze, as people had started calling it. Boarded windows, patched roofs, streaks of water damage marking walls like tears. But beneath the damage, life was returning. Flowers pushed through thawed earth. Birds sang in the recovering pines. Children played in yards again, their laughter a sound the town had missed desperately. Marcus stood on his property, watching the last patches of snow disappear from the shadows beneath the trees. The entrance to his shelter sat open now, no longer hidden, no longer a secret. The town council had asked him to keep it accessible as an official emergency refuge. He'd agreed, though part of him wanted to seal it up and forget it existed, to let it return to being just a hole in the ground. But Raymond was right. You couldn't go back. Only forward. His phone rang, the new one he'd finally broken down and bought after dozens of people had asked how to reach him. The screen showed Jennifer's name. "Marcus, it's Sarah. She wants to see you. Can you come by the house?" 20 minutes later, Marcus stood in the Hendricks' small living room, freshly repaired, still smelling of paint and new drywall. Sarah sat on the couch nursing Hope, who was now 3 months old, healthy and growing, a miracle in pink pajamas. "I wanted you to meet her properly," Sarah said, "not in crisis mode, just as a baby." Marcus sat carefully in the armchair across from them. Hope had finished nursing and Sarah held her out. "Want to hold her?" Marcus hesitated, then took the infant carefully, supporting her head the way he remembered from Emma. Hope was warm and solid, her eyes unfocused, mouth working in small movements. She smelled like milk and baby soap and new life. Something cracked open in Marcus's chest, something that had been sealed for 3 years. He'd thought he could never hold a child again without it destroying him, without seeing Emma in every face, hearing Sarah in every cry. But Hope was her own person, with her own life, her own future, all of it possible because of choices he'd made. "She's beautiful," Marcus managed, his voice rough. "She wouldn't be here without you," Sarah said softly. "Not just because you saved us, but because you gave us a place safe enough that my body didn't go into crisis labor. Jennifer said stress can trigger premature birth. But I felt safe in your shelter, protected. That's why Hope was born healthy." Marcus looked down at the baby in his arms. This was legacy, not plaques or ceremonies or newspaper articles. This life, these eyes, this future. Every choice he'd made, every hour spent building, every dollar spent on supplies had led to this moment. A child who existed because he'd refused to let tragedy make him give up. "Thank you for letting me meet her," Marcus said, handing Hope back carefully. "You're welcome here anytime," Tom said from the doorway where he'd been watching. "You're family now. That's what we tell everyone. Marcus Webb is family." The word settled in Marcus's heart like a seed in thawed ground. Over the following weeks, invitations multiplied. Dinners at people's homes, barbecues in backyards, birthday parties for children who wanted Mr. Marcus there. He'd gone from invisible to inescapable, and it was overwhelming in ways he couldn't articulate. But Raymond pushed him to accept, to show up, to let people express their gratitude. "They need to thank you," Raymond explained over coffee one morning. "Not for your sake, but for theirs. Gratitude is how people process trauma. Let them heal by letting them honor you." So Marcus showed up. He ate casseroles and burgers. He played with children who wanted to hear stories about the shelter. He listened to adults talk about their recovery, their repairs, their plans to be better prepared next time. And slowly, without realizing it was happening, he became part of the community in a way he'd never been before. The preparedness workshops continued, growing larger each time. What had started as 50 people became 75, then 100. People drove in from neighboring towns, having heard about the man who'd saved Pine Ridge. Marcus taught them everything, holding nothing back: shelter design, water filtration, food storage, medical preparedness, psychological resilience. A journalist from Denver attended one workshop and wrote a feature article. Then a regional magazine picked it up. Then a national news outlet. Suddenly, Marcus was being contacted by emergency management organizations, survival groups, engineering firms, everyone wanting to know his secrets. "There are no secrets," he told them all, "just preparation and commitment." But they didn't want simple answers. They wanted blueprints, specifications, detailed plans. So Marcus, with Raymond's help, began compiling everything into a comprehensive guide. They worked late into spring evenings, documenting every aspect of the shelter's design, every lesson learned from housing 183 people for 2 weeks. Patricia, the council member who'd once opposed him so vocally, became an unexpected ally. She coordinated with state officials to create a grant program for community emergency shelters. She invited Marcus to speak at county meetings, state conferences, even a congressional hearing in Washington about disaster preparedness. Marcus hated the travel, the attention, the cameras. But he went because Raymond convinced him it mattered. "You've got knowledge that could save thousands of lives," Raymond said. "Maybe millions if enough people listen. You owe it to Sarah and Emma to make their loss count for something." That argument always worked. Marcus would do anything if it honored his lost family. In May, the town held a ceremony to officially dedicate the shelter. They'd installed a proper entrance structure, replacing Marcus's tool shed with a reinforced building designed to withstand extreme weather. A bronze plaque mounted beside the door read, "The Webb Emergency Shelter, dedicated to Marcus Webb, whose vision and courage saved 183 lives during the Great Freeze of 2025. May this place stand as proof that one person can make a difference. Marcus stood before the crowd of several hundred people, many of them the ones he'd saved, others from neighboring towns who'd come to see the legendary shelter. Mayor Pritchard, walking now without his crutch, gave a speech about heroism and community. Patricia spoke about the importance of preparedness. Children who'd survived in the shelter sang a song they'd written about being safe underground. Then it was Marcus's turn. He approached the microphone, hands sweating, heart pounding. Public speaking terrified him more than the cold ever had. But when he looked out at the crowd and saw faces he knew, families he'd saved, children who were alive because of choices he'd made, the fear settled into something manageable. 3 years ago, Marcus began, his voice amplified across the gathering. I lost everything that mattered to me. My wife Sarah and my daughter Emma died in a flash flood because we weren't prepared for something that seemed impossible. The experts said we were safe. The forecasts said the storm would miss us, and we trusted them because that's what people do. We trust that someone else is thinking about the worst-case scenarios so we don't have to. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But what I learned that day, in the worst way possible, is that no one else is responsible for your safety. Not the government, not the experts, not the weather service. Only you can decide what level of risk you're willing to accept. Only you can prepare for the disasters everyone else says won't happen. The crowd was silent, attentive. When I moved to Pine Ridge, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just trying to survive my grief. Building this shelter was therapy as much as preparation. Every bolt I tightened, every system I installed, every supply I stocked was me saying, I will not be helpless again. I will not watch people I care about die because no one was ready. He looked at the shelter entrance, then back at the crowd. I didn't build this place expecting to save the whole town. I built it hoping to save maybe my neighbors, maybe a few families. The fact that it held 183 people was as much luck as design. But it worked because I believed the impossible could happen. And when it did, we were ready. Marcus's voice grew stronger. That's what I want everyone to take from this. Not that I'm special, not that I'm a hero. I'm just a broken man who refused to let his brokenness make him useless. Every single person here has the capacity to prepare, to think ahead, to imagine the worst and plan for it. You don't need to be an engineer. You don't need to be wealthy. You just need to care enough about the people you love to do something before disaster strikes. He gestured to the families in the crowd. These people are alive because I prepared. But more importantly, they're alive because when the moment came, they trusted me. They followed a man most of them had mocked or ignored. They put aside their pride and their prejudice, and they let me help them. That's the other lesson here. When someone offers help, when someone shows you they're prepared, listen to them. Don't wait until you're freezing to death to realize the crazy guy might have been right all along. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus smiled slightly. I'm not angry about the mockery, I understand it. What I did seemed extreme until it wasn't, but I hope Pine Ridge has learned that preparation isn't paranoia. It's love. It's the deepest expression of love to say I care about you so much that I'm willing to imagine you might need help someday, and I'm going to be ready to give it. He took a breath, nearing the end. This shelter will remain open. If disaster strikes again, you know where to come. But more than that, I hope you'll build your own shelters. I hope you'll stock your own supplies. I hope you'll create your own plans. Because the next time, I might not be here. The next disaster might be different. The only way we survive as a community is if we all take responsibility for each other's safety. Marcus looked directly at the children in the crowd. You kids who survived in this shelter, you're going to grow up remembering what happened. You're going to tell your own children someday about the Great Freeze and how Pine Ridge survived. Make sure the lesson you pass on isn't just that Marcus Webb saved everyone. Make sure it's that one person who prepares, who thinks ahead, who refuses to assume everything will be fine, can change everything. Be that person for your community. That's how we honor what happened here. He stepped back from the microphone. The crowd rose as one, applause thundering across the property. People were crying, cheering, children waving signs they'd made. Marcus felt overwhelmed, grateful, and ready for it to be over. But first came the ribbon cutting. Mayor Pritchard handed him oversized scissors. Sarah brought baby Hope forward, dressed in a tiny pink outfit. Together they cut the ribbon across the shelter entrance, officially dedicating it to public service. Cameras flashed. People surged forward to see inside. Marcus gave tours, answering questions, explaining systems. He must have walked 100 people through the space that afternoon, each time marveling that this hole in the ground had become a landmark, a symbol, a beacon of hope. As evening approached and crowds thinned, Marcus found himself alone in the shelter. He walked through the empty space, remembering how it had looked packed with humanity. The bunks where children had slept, the kitchen area where volunteers had prepared meals, the medical corner where Jennifer had cared for the sick, the memorial wall where 4 names still hung, a reminder that preparation wasn't perfect, that loss was inevitable, even when you did everything right. He heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to see Raymond descending, moving easier now that his feet had healed. "Hell of a day," the old veteran said. "Hell of a 3 years," Marcus replied. They stood together in the quiet shelter, 2 men who'd been strangers and were now bonded by crisis survived and lessons learned. "What now?" Raymond asked. "What do you mean? You've got offers, teaching positions, consulting contracts. That engineering firm in Denver wants to hire you full-time. What are you going to do?" Marcus had been avoiding thinking about it. The offers were tempting. Good money, important work, a chance to make a real difference on a larger scale. But something held him back. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to stay here. This is home now, I think. These people, they're family." "They are," Raymond agreed. "But you've got knowledge that needs sharing beyond Pine Ridge. You've got a responsibility to the people who might be saved by what you teach." "I can't save everyone." "No? But you can try to save more than you did. That's what leaders do. They scale their impact." Marcus considered that. Leadership. He'd never wanted it, never sought it, but it had found him anyway. And maybe Raymond was right. Maybe honoring Sarah and Emma meant taking what he'd learned and spreading it as far as possible. "What would you do?" Marcus asked. Raymond smiled. "I'd split the difference. Keep Pine Ridge as your base. This is home. But travel when needed. Teach, consult, write that book everyone's asking for. Build a training center here where people can come learn. Make this place a hub for disaster preparedness, not just a memorial to one storm." The idea took root immediately. A training center, where people could come experience emergency conditions in a controlled environment, where they could learn hands-on skills, where they could understand viscerally what crisis felt like and how to handle it. "That's actually brilliant," Marcus said. "I have my moments." Over the summer, plans took shape. Marcus partnered with several organizations to create the Pine Ridge Center for Emergency Preparedness. They'd use his property, expand the shelter, build training facilities. Experts would come teach courses, families could attend workshops, emergency managers could get hands-on experience. The town embraced the project enthusiastically. It would bring jobs, revenue, recognition. Pine Ridge, population 1,100, was about to become known for something other than being almost wiped out. They'd be known for surviving, learning, and teaching others. Patricia helped navigate the bureaucracy. Mayor Pritchard secured state funding. Raymond agreed to serve as operations director. Jennifer designed the medical training program. Even Dale, the chronic complainer, found purpose coordinating logistics. By August, construction had begun. New buildings rose beside the shelter, a classroom facility, a dormitory for residential courses, a simulation building where they could recreate emergency conditions. Marcus worked alongside the contractors, unable to stay away from something he'd dreamed into existence. One afternoon, while he was reviewing architectural plans, a car pulled up he didn't recognize. A woman got out, mid-30s, professional attire, expensive shoes that looked out of place on his dusty property. "Marcus Webb?" she asked. "That's me." I'm Dr. Alison Chen, FEMA's Director of Community Resilience. I've been following your story. Mind if we talk? They sat on the tailgate of his truck, and Dr. Chen explained that FEMA wanted to feature the Pine Ridge shelter in a national preparedness campaign. They wanted to create detailed guides based on his design. They wanted to fund similar shelters in vulnerable communities across the country. What you did here, it's scalable, she said. We've calculated that if every town of comparable size had even a basic version of your shelter, we could reduce disaster mortality by 40% or more. That's thousands of lives per year. Marcus felt the weight of that number. Thousands of lives, families that wouldn't have to experience what he'd experienced, children who'd grow up with parents who might otherwise have died in floods or fires or freezing cold. What do you need from me? He asked. Everything. Your time, your knowledge, your story. We want you to be the face of this initiative. I know that's asking a lot, but people respond to personal stories. They need to see that preparation isn't about fear, it's about love, and you embody that better than anyone. Marcus looked at his property, at the buildings rising from ground that had been empty a year ago. He thought about Sarah and Emma, about the 3 years he'd spent drowning in guilt, about the 183 people who were alive because he'd refused to let that guilt paralyze him. I'll do it, he said, on one condition. Name it. Every shelter built with FEMA support, every community that uses this design, they name it after someone they lost. Not after me, after someone local who didn't survive. These shelters should be memorials as much as refuges. They should honor the people we couldn't save while protecting the ones we still can. Dr. Chen's eyes glistened. That's beautiful. And appropriate. Yes, we'll make that part of the program. By September, Marcus found himself traveling regularly. He spoke at conferences and universities and town halls. He showed his designs and shared his story and answered endless questions. It was exhausting and uncomfortable and the most meaningful work he'd ever done. But he always returned to Pine Ridge. This was home. These were his people. And increasingly, this felt like family in the truest sense. On October 15th, the anniversary of when he'd started building the shelter, the town threw a party. Not for him specifically, though he was the guest of honor. They called it Preparedness Day and made it an annual event. Tables filled the town square with emergency supply vendors, training organizations, insurance companies offering disaster coverage. Children learned first aid and fire safety. Adults practiced emergency response scenarios. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Webb, no longer the broken stranger who'd moved to town 3 years ago, but a pillar of the community, a teacher, a friend, a symbol of what was possible when you refused to give up. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Marcus returned to his property. The training center was nearly complete, set to open next month. He walked the grounds as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold. The shelter entrance stood open, welcoming, no longer hidden or secret, a place of safety, waiting for whenever it might be needed again. He descended the stairs and walked through the empty space. His footsteps echoed off concrete walls that had held so many people, so many lives, so much hope. He stopped at the memorial wall where 4 names still hung: Tom, Helen, Marcus, James, people who hadn't made it, who'd been lost to cold and circumstance and the cruel randomness of disaster. He pulled out a marker and added 2 more names in smaller letters beneath the others. Sarah Webb. Emma Webb. His family. The reason for everything. I hope I've made you proud, he whispered to the names, to the memory, to the 3 years of grief that had transformed into purpose. I couldn't save you, but I've saved others, and I'll keep saving them for as long as I'm able. That's my promise to you. That's how I honor your memory, by making sure other families don't lose what I lost. The shelter didn't answer, but Marcus didn't need it to. He knew in his bones that Sarah would be proud. Emma would think the shelter was the coolest fort ever built. They would approve of what he'd done with his pain, how he'd transformed tragedy into survival, loss into legacy. He climbed the stairs and emerged into the cool evening air. Stars were beginning to appear, brilliant against the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping, as it always did in the mountains, but it was autumn cold, manageable, survivable. Nothing like the brutal freeze that had nearly destroyed everything. Raymond's truck pulled up the driveway, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. The old veteran got out, carrying a six-pack of beer and a bag of takeout. "Figured you'd be out here brooding," Raymond said. "Thought you could use company." They sat on the tailgate of Marcus's truck, eating burgers and drinking beer, watching the stars multiply overhead. Two men who'd become brothers through crisis, who'd learned that family wasn't always blood, that home wasn't always where you started, that sometimes the worst things in life prepared you for the best work you'd ever do. "You know what I realized today?" Marcus said after a long, comfortable silence. "What's that?" "I'm happy. For the first time since the flood, I'm actually happy. Not just surviving or coping or existing, actually happy." Raymond smiled. "That's good. That's real good. Sarah and Emma, they'd want that for you." "I know. It still feels strange, though, like I don't deserve it." "Happiness isn't about deserving. It's about allowing. You've spent 3 years earning the right to live again. Now you just have to let yourself do it." Marcus nodded, letting that wisdom settle. Around them, the night deepened. Somewhere in town, families were sitting down to dinner. Children were doing homework. Adults were watching television or reading books or planning tomorrow. Normal life, continuing as it always did, made possible by 1,000 small choices about preparation and safety that most people never thought about. But Marcus thought about them. And now he was teaching others to think about them too. That was his gift, born from his tragedy. The ability to imagine disaster and plan for it without being paralyzed by fear. To prepare without despairing. To build shelters, both physical and emotional, where people could survive the storms that life inevitably brought. The training center opened in November to a full roster of courses. People came from across the country to learn, engineers studying shelter design, emergency managers practicing crisis response, families learning how to protect themselves. Each group left with knowledge and skills and, more importantly, with the understanding that one person could make a difference. Marcus taught many of the courses himself, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the philosophy behind it. Preparation as an act of love, resilience as a choice, community as the ultimate survival tool. He told his story over and over, not because he enjoyed reliving the pain, but because people needed to understand where the motivation came from. Why someone would spend their life savings digging a hole in the ground. Why being called crazy was worth it if it meant saving lives. And people listened. They learned. They went home and built their own preparedness plans. They created neighborhood emergency networks. They stocked supplies and trained in first aid and thought about what-ifs they'd previously ignored. The ripple effect was exactly what Marcus had hoped for. Pine Ridge's survival had become a model, a proof of concept, evidence that preparation worked. The web shelter wasn't just a building anymore. It was an idea spreading across the country, taking root in communities that understood they couldn't count on luck to survive disaster. In December, 1 year after the Great Freeze, the town held a memorial service. They gathered at the cemetery where the 4 residents who'd died were buried. Marcus stood before the graves, joined by families and friends, and spoke about loss and survival, about how the two were forever intertwined, how you couldn't truly appreciate life until you'd faced death. "Tom, Helen, Marcus, James," he said, reading the names on the headstones. "They didn't survive, and that will always be a tragedy. But their loss taught us something crucial. That preparation matters, that community matters, that we have to look out for each other, especially when things get hard. These 4 people, through their deaths, saved countless lives by showing us what happens when we're not ready." He placed flowers on each grave, then stepped back. The crowd sang a hymn, voices rising into the cold December air. It was healing and heartbreaking in equal measure, a community processing trauma together, refusing to forget those they'd lost while celebrating those who'd survived. After the service, people gathered at the community center for a remembrance dinner. Stories were shared, Laughter mixed with tears, children played while adults reminisced. Marcus moved through the crowd, no longer uncomfortable with attention, accepting hugs and handshakes and expressions of gratitude with grace he'd learned over the past year. Sarah and Tom brought Hope, now almost a year old, taking her first wobbly steps, squealing with delight at every new discovery. Marcus watched her toddle across the room and felt profound satisfaction. This child, this life, this future, all made possible by choices he'd made when everyone thought he was crazy. As midnight approached and the gathering began to thin, Marcus found himself on the community center's porch, looking out at Pine Ridge's quiet streets. Lights glowed in windows, smoke curled from chimneys. Life continued, warm and safe, ordinary and precious. Raymond joined him, as he so often did, silent companionship that needed no explanation. "You did good," the old veteran said simply. "We did good," Marcus corrected. "None of this happens without you." "Maybe, but I didn't build the shelter. I didn't save the town. That was all you." Marcus shook his head. "I built a hole in the ground. The town saved itself by being willing to help each other, by putting aside pride and fear and prejudice. I just provided the place where that could happen." They stood together in the cold December night, two men who understood that survival was never about individual heroism. It was about community, connection, the willingness to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best, and the courage to help others even when they'd given you every reason not to. Behind them, through the community center windows, Marcus could see families laughing together, children playing, life blooming in the middle of winter. Not despite the Great Freeze, but because of it. Because sometimes the worst things teach the most important lessons. Because sometimes being broken is what prepares you to help others heal. Because sometimes the man everyone calls crazy is the sanest person in the room. Marcus Webb had learned all of this the hard way, and now, through his shelter and his teaching and his example, he was making sure others didn't have to learn it alone. The stars blazed overhead, cold and distant and beautiful. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees, winter cold, but nothing like the -50 that had nearly destroyed them. Survivable cold. The kind humans were built to endure with proper preparation. And Marcus had taught them all how to prepare. That was his gift, his purpose, his way of honoring Sarah and Emma. Not by drowning in grief, but by swimming through it to save others from the same fate. Not by giving up, but by building something that would outlast him, something that would protect people he'd never meet, in disasters he'd never see, long after he was gone. That was legacy. That was meaning. That was why one man digging a hole in the ground could change everything. Anyone can change the world if they're willing to prepare for what everyone else says will never happen, stay committed when the whole world calls them crazy, and care enough about others to build something that might save them someday. As the stars turned overhead and Pine Ridge slept peacefully beneath the winter sky, Marcus Webb knew with certainty that his life had meaning again. Not the meaning he'd planned, not the life he'd wanted, but something deeper and truer. He'd been broken by tragedy and rebuilt by purpose. He'd lost everything and found something worth living for. He'd been called crazy and proven prophetically sane, and in doing so, he'd shown every person watching that survival isn't about luck or wealth or power. It's about preparation, commitment, and love fierce enough to imagine the worst and refuse to let it win. Because for Marcus and for everyone whose life he'd touched, the story wasn't about one winter storm, or one shelter, or even 183 people saved. It was about proving that one person, armed with vision and determination, could build something strong enough to protect an entire community. And that lesson would echo far beyond Pine Ridge, far beyond one frozen winter, far into a future where Marcus Webb's name might be forgotten, but his impact would endure forever. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of courage and survival. Click now to continue the journey with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe one person can change everything.